Okay. So good morning and thank you. Our paper, Professor Gerald Steinberg's, Becca, Wertman, and mine. Becca and I are both researchers at NGO Monitor at the Institute for NGO Research. So our paper looks into an emerging public discourse on EU funding to NGOs that is taking place within the EU. And we argue this could have implications for EU-Israel relations. I will skim our findings very quickly because there is a time constraint. I'll start with a short literature review and some basics on EU funding to NGOs, how it works. And then through 3 examples, I will show the debate that we are seeing is emerging within the EU and what possible implications it could have for EU-Israel relations. The whole phenomenon we look into is very new, so it could benefit from further research, both in terms of how it will affect the EU discourse and policies and how it will affect relations with Israel. So there's been a lot of academic research on NGO funding. Western governments fund NGOs primarily as a foreign policy instrument, and we see that within that, Professor Ilan mentioned a very broad interpretation of human rights, which has led to what is called a rights-based approach to development aid. And this has, in recipient countries, has become a source of friction, and NGOs feature very prominently in this. And specifically in Israel, as you are all very well aware, I'm sure, NGO funding is a source of tension, specifically in EU-Israel relations, because the EU is also the biggest funder for NGOs in the region. In contrast to this literature, we want to look into how is NGO funding perceived in the EU as a public instrument, as an issue of public spending. And until recently, it has barely been discussed because most of this funding has no direct effect over EU constituencies. But we see in the context of the refugee crisis and other developments, such as the rise of populism and other things we'll hear about a lot today, I'm sure, there is more and more discussion on this issue and more sensitivities are arising. And we believe that this could at least help bridge some of the conceptual gaps, specifically on NGO funding between Israel and the EU. So, how does the EU fund NGOs? To the extent that there has been a discussion, academic and otherwise, on EU funding to NGOs, the focus has actually been on this funding as a form of engineered interest representation. Mostly it's been framed as NGOs receive funding in order to represent what are perceived as marginalized interests, and in this way they counterbalance very powerful interest groups such as corporate lobbyists and industry representatives. And this is indeed a part of NGO funding, of EU funding to NGOs, but it is, in terms of quantity, it is actually a very small part. We have here some data from a study commissioned by the European Parliament that looked into the top 28 NGO beneficiaries in 2015, which received a total of 600 million euros. And almost 100% of this sum was designated for overseas activities and came from departments in charge of external action. Over 90% is humanitarian and development aid, and some 8% is the European Neighborhood Policy and the Foreign Policy Instrument. And then we see that departments that are in charge of more domestic policy areas such as environment, health, social issues, the sums are very negligible in comparison. So in actuality, NGOs mostly receive funding for service provision and in order to implement very specific EU policies that are dictated by the EU. However, complicating this distinction between service provision and interest representation, EU foreign aid has undergone a process of politicization. So again, I mentioned the rights-based approach previously, and Professor Lando mentioned the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is indeed quite a broad interpretation of human rights, but was still subject to a lot of negotiations and contestation, and is still narrower than the interpretation of human rights in the EU's foreign policy, and specifically in its aid policy. And this has created a shift in aid from service provision, or a traditional needs-based approach, more towards calling out duty bearers, monitoring violations, and activities that are very political in nature and related to advocacy. These are two, oh, whoops. Do you know what happened? There, I don't know, if you managed to get a look, there were two pictures sort of illustrating the difference. It's a reception issue. Should I wait or should I continue with the laptop maybe?
Can you talk without?
The show must go on.
Yeah.
The show must go on. Okay.
Some of us started our careers without PowerPoint. Well, didn't computers.
I definitely didn't. I definitely didn't.
Yeah.
So, this change in foreign policy aid and the distinction between service provision, interest representation, which created a lot of confusion in the debate surrounding NGO funding, which is growing within the EU. So we looked into 3 examples of this debate. The first is a European Parliament initiative made by MEP Markus Pieper, who's a German MEP of the EPP group. And it is an initiative that made a lot of waves, that called for stricter funding to stricter regulations on NGO funding, and elicited very, very passionate responses from all sides. And the concerns were mostly regarding EU-funded NGOs that undermine EU values, violate EU policies, and also propagate misinformation and falsehoods. These were the allegations, and these were the concerns. And of course, there were also counter-reactions. The second example we looked into, this is it. This is a screenshot of an article. This is the second example. The EU allocated very big sums to NGOs in order to deliver humanitarian aid in Greece, in refugee camps, which is a unique case of humanitarian aid being delivered within EU borders. And this very quickly resulted in tensions. I'll just read the subheading. Despite millions of euros available for relief efforts, refugees in Greece continue to live in terrible conditions as the government and NGOs trade accusations of mismanagement. And these concerns were also echoed by the Greek government, the EU Commission, and local NGOs. And eventually the contracts were terminated and the responsibility to deliver aid was handed over to the Greek government. Yeah. And the last example we look into, I think this received most public attention, is NGO involvement in rescue missions. These rescue missions weren't funded by the EU, but many of the NGOs involved are generally funded by the EU. And this also resulted in tensions between the NGOs, the EU's border control agency, and the Italian government, and eventually also the Libyan authorities. I'll just also read the headline here. EU border force flags concerns over charities' interaction with migrant smugglers. And eventually, it was more because of confrontations with Libyan authorities, but these rescue missions, the NGO involvement has also ended as of now. We don't know what will be. The main themes that we see in all of these examples are sovereignty-related sensitivities, more broader issues such as delegation of authority, who manages what, who manages public funds, but also issues that are at the very heart of sovereignty, border control and immigration. And more in the European Parliament initiative, we see populism-related concerns such as misinformation, polarization, and some radicalization in political discourse, and concerns related to EU-funded NGOs. How is this relevant for EU-Israel relations? We see that there is a fundamental discrepancy between the EU and Israel in how NGO funding is perceived. And this is across the border. In Israel, whether this funding is viewed as a positive or negative involvement, it is generally viewed as a form of soft power, of normative power Europe, and a means of influencing Israeli public discourse. However, the EU has been very consistent in presenting this funding as very targeted, project-based interventions with specific policy objectives that are essentially apolitical. And whether on both sides this is viewed as a good or bad thing, it has created sort of a disconnect in the debate. And we believe that the emerging debate within the EU has the potential to bridge these gaps and maybe bring about a more constructive dialogue. So hopefully when there are questions, there will be time to go into detail and into more things, but this is all I have time for. So thank you very much.